A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. I never thought a simple question about showering could unravel so much about my life, but here we are. It all started the day my roommate, Jake, casually asked in our group chat if everyone preferred to shower in the morning or at night, and I replied with a nonchalant, "At night, obviously. Who wants to start their day all wet and uncomfortable?" Little did I know that my humorous quip would ignite a minor controversy, leading to a rift between us and uncovering deeper, more personal conflicts within myself. You see, Jake and I had shared a small apartment for about a year now after college, thrown together by the randomness of online roommate listings. He was easygoing, while I tended to be more of an introvert, preferring the solace of late-night gaming marathons to the noisy bustling of parties. That night, I could almost see the flicker of indignation from him through my phone screen as he fired back about how refreshing and invigorating a morning shower could be, creating an almost evangelical fervor in the chat. As playful banter turned into a back and forth that had others joining the thread like old schoolmates reunited, I found my dissatisfaction with the discussion pooling into something darker. Wasn't this just a harmless debate? Yet, the more we discussed it, the more I felt my own insecurities bubble up. After all, my nighttime showers were more than a choice of cleanliness, they became my sanctuary, my shield against the day that had just passed. They were prayers whispered in the steam, reflections shared with the dull hum of water against porcelain. Realization hit me, it wasn't the water itself but the comfort I found in solitude that I protected fiercely. Days passed, and that small spark of humor in a Facebook thread morphed into silent tension. I could sense Jake's frustration swirling about like a summer storm he kept bottled up, and soon it spilled over into our daily interactions. He started to leave for work earlier, making it apparent that my nighttime routine was becoming an inconvenience, and I felt that old familiar sting of guilt prick my conscience. The idea of me being selfish over something so trivial gnawed at my mind, and I wondered if I was wrong to cling so tightly to my rituals. One evening, after another long day of indecision and hours spent analyzing what seemed like a ghost of a conversation, I broke down, standing in the bathroom, water cascading down my back, the temperature just hot enough to sting, barely feeling its familiar embrace as I wrestled with my feelings. My phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Jake read, "Let's talk." Unease settled in my stomach as I switched off the shower, suddenly conscious of the silence surrounding me. The conversation we desperately needed felt like a freight train barreling toward us, ready to collide. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table later that night felt like stepping onto a tightrope. I stared into his furrowed brows, willing myself to speak. First, fearing the conflict would only wash over us again if I didn't clear the air. Before either of us could speak, he let out a short laugh tinged with frustration and said, "I apologize. I didn't mean to make it feel like there was a right or wrong way to shower." His words hung in the air, and it felt like a release. I hadn't expected to find comfort and laughter amid a dispute, but it worked, and soon we were able to share perspectives, me recounting my childhood memories of feeling lost in an overwhelming world, where my safe haven lay in those evening rituals. He talked about his love for dawn and how it energized his spirit, and for the first time since this began, we listened rather than debated. As the conversation shifted from a simple showering preference to something beautifully profound, we learned about one another in ways that surprised us both. The interaction ended with a gentle understanding, no solutions, just acceptance. We agreed to let our different routines coexist. I would respect his morning preference while finding space to shower at night, and surprisingly enough, I felt lighter. The emotional shadows that had clawed at me lifted, showing that our differences weren't barriers but rather opportunities for compassion and growth. Reflecting on those moments now, I realize how much we often overlook the power of small things, how the simplest questions can lead to deeper understanding and connection over something as mundane as a shower schedule. It's an ongoing balance we're learning to strike in our shared lives, reminding me that personal rituals, no matter how small, are just as vital as the space we foster with others. As I wash away the day each night, I can still feel that fresh hope for what lies ahead, and in the morning sun, I can always sense a little invigorating joy. Life has a peculiar way of exposing what we truly need and teaching us that sometimes, even in the trivialities, we find our most profound truths. Update: it's been several months since that incident, and I wanted to share how our relationship has transformed. We've navigated our differences thoughtfully, discussing everything from chores to routines without resentment. Even negotiating bathroom time has turned into a communal ritual where we leave uplifting notes for one another. So if you're wondering whether there's a right way to shower, the answer is simply, whatever keeps you grounded. It was a crisp autumn evening when I realized just how much our little ritual had changed the dynamic in our home. The sunlight had surrendered to an early dusk, casting a soft golden hue through our living room windows. I reclined on our well-loved couch, a spot where countless discussions had unfolded, and listened to the rustling of leaves outside, a gentle reminder of the world continuing its cycle. My thoughts drifted to Alex, sitting at the kitchen table, pencil poised over a new notepad filled with doodles and half-formed ideas. He had taken up writing recently, spurred by our shared commitment to appreciating the small joys in life. There was something deeply comforting in watching him, a mundane moment that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Just last week, we had joked about me showering in the morning while he preferred the nighttime cleanse, yet today, the topic felt a bit richer, a bit deeper. I smiled at how we'd turned something as trivial as shower preferences into an exploration of our personalities, how I thrived in morning routines, using that time to gather energy for the day ahead, while he found solace in the water's warmth as he washed away the weight of the world. It was a playful battle that had transformed into a comforting acknowledgement of our differences. Each note we left for the other became a reminder that it was perfectly okay to clash in some areas, as long as we supported one another through it. My heart swelled with gratitude as I recalled those late-night discussions after I'd come from my morning shower, the way he would tease me about my overly cheerful attitude, but ultimately end up smiling at my boundless enthusiasm. Suddenly, the kettle whistled, and Alex poured himself a cup of tea, a daily ritual that we both cherished, paired perfectly with those brief moments of connection. As he walked over and handed me a warm mug, our fingers brushed together, sending a flash of warmth up my arm that transcended the chill in the air. I couldn't help but marvel at how simple acts of care had bridged the gap that once felt insurmountable, a soothing balm for old grievances. "Hey," I said softly, "do you remember that week when we almost moved out separate ways because of shower timing?" The question hung in the air, and I watched as he chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, how ridiculous was that? All over a shower." His laughter was contagious, and soon we were both grinning at how we had almost let something so trivial unravel the fabric of our relationship. It felt reassuring to know that our love had grown stronger rather than strained, forged in discussion and subtle compromises, reminding us that we are imperfect creatures working together to create a harmonious existence. Doing the dishes next to one another had become a place of laughter and shared stories instead of a dreaded chore. Morning chores transformed into affectionate exchanges where we shared dreams and ambitions. As we sat there, sipping our tea and allowing the warmth to seep into our bones, I thought back to our first months together when I had been so rigid in my routines and he, in his. Life had a funny way of teaching, didn't it? We had grown, molded by our conversations and the light-hearted notes exchanged in the bathroom, a playful nudge toward understanding. Now, our mornings began with warmth, not just in water but in attitude, as we greeted each new day as friends and partners, no longer battling for control over a single moment of quiet. Sometimes, before climbing into bed, we'd take a moment to acknowledge those notes through whispers in the dark, a quiet acknowledgement of how far we had shifted from our old stances. I marveled at how our relationship was no longer simply about shower timing but about meeting one another in all our complexities, learning to dance through the friction. And as the moonlight filtered through the curtains of our cozy home, I realized that we'd not only learned about how to shower together, but also how to love without reservations, how to embrace our idiosyncrasies and transform them into stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. In the end, I imagined any asking about the right way to shower would yield a simple truth. It wasn't about the timing or the order of events, it was about merging routines with the love that bathed them in understanding. And maybe that mattered more than a perfectly scalding shower or the ideal evening ritual. What mattered was how we chose to show up for one another, day after day. As I placed the empty teacup down, our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw our future stretching out before us, a tapestry woven from the threads of shared quirks, affection, and understanding. The world beyond our little home could keep spinning chaotically, but together, we had found a tranquil center, our shower of love above all else. As I sank back into the soft embrace of the couch, just beneath the warm light of our modest living room, I couldn't help but smile at how far we'd come since that initial shower debate. Kevin and I had always been an odd couple. He was the nocturnal artist, paint-splattered and lost in dreams of faraway worlds, while I preferred the precision and calm of daylight, my mind firing off plans like a pinball machine. But that stark difference, as irksome as it had once seemed, became our greatest strength. Together, we had cultivated a delicate dance of compromise and love that seeped into every facet of our daily lives. We had showered each other's worries away over countless mornings and evenings, sharing masks made from avocados and honey, turning what could have been mundane into a cherished tradition. It's strange to think that something as simple as agreeing on shower times could lead us here, sipping chamomile tea on a lazy Saturday, enjoying the comfortable silence that only partners can share. And yet, it was during one of those particularly rainy weekends, when the world outside was blanketed in gray, that a challenge nudged at our peaceful existence. It all began when we decided to tidy up the clutter that had accumulated in our tiny apartment, a process filled with nostalgia as we sifted through memories, old photographs, forgotten receipts, and trinkets swapped during travels long past. It was cathartic, yet strangely revealing. In a forgotten shoebox, I uncovered a letter from my grandmother, a woman whose wisdom often lingered in my heart and shaped my decisions. She had always extolled the virtues of patience, urging me to embrace both the mundane and the extraordinary. Tucked within the letter was a small envelope containing a photograph of her, young and radiant, showering under a rain-soaked sun, an expression of pure bliss etched on her face. Feeling nostalgic, I shared the photo with Kevin, leaning into the warm light of our dining table, where we had discovered so many of life's little treasures together. His eyes danced with curiosity as he absorbed the innocence of my grandmother's joy. "You know," he said, picking up a crumpled photo we had taken during a spontaneous road trip last summer, "this reminds me of that time we ended up at that little diner, the one with the bad coffee and the amazing pie." His words somehow ignited something in me, a realization that perhaps our cherished routines weren't just about the tasks we performed but the space we carved out for each other's memories. Over the next few days, as we dug deeper into the heart of our belongings, I began to notice something that made my stomach twist in knots. The more we unearthed, the more I felt the edges of Kevin's world encroaching upon my own, his sketchbooks piled high, unfinished canvases leaning against walls like silent witnesses. It was beautiful, this mountain of his creativity. It was also chaotic. The blending of our lives had created a beautiful mess, and yet I was surprised to find that I wanted more clarity, an oasis of order in the thrumming current of our differing habits. I hesitated, unsure if voicing this desire would unearth resentment or frustration from Kevin. At the same time, I feared that even questioning our newfound tranquility would send ripples across our carefully crafted relationship. How could I express this without sounding ungrateful? One evening, as the faint light of day slipped outside the window, I summoned the courage to broach the subject. "Hey, love, can we talk about our space?" I began softly, watching his hands pause mid-sketch. His expression hardened slightly, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his features, and I had a second of panic, my heart racing with the fear of undoing everything good we had built. But there was kindness in his voice when he responded, "Yeah, I think that's important." We both took a moment to breathe, tapping into the patience my grandmother had once preached. The conversation unfolded like a delicate flower, careful petals yielding to disclose deeper thoughts. We discussed how each of us viewed our personal space, the orderly retreat I sought and the creative chaos that Kevin thrived in. By the time we wrapped things up, the remnants of doubt had transformed into an understanding that felt like healing. We spent the following Saturdays rearranging our home, consciously carving out pockets of solitude amid his expansive imagination. He set up an art corner that faced the balcony, allowing sunlight to pour over his sketches while isolating them from the clutter I had wrested away with tenderness. I soon realized each little corner brought an essence of both our worlds to life. My tidy nook filled with books and plants reflected calm, while his vibrant canvas, peppered with splashes of color, became an almost sacred space of inspiration. Life, with all its routine showers and soft moments of understanding, began to shift yet again, reflecting the beauty of our harmonious union. What I had feared may disrupt us transformed into the roots of genuine growth, watering both our styles without overshadowing either. With the rain tapping rhythmically against the window, I sat beside him, watching the world drip outside, a world that still spun chaotically. We were now crafting something deeper, balance and love, proof that asking for what you need doesn't mean you're breaking, but rather evolving. Each brushstroke he painted felt like our journey, and I couldn't help but see the future extending before us, full of color and light. Months down the road, as another rainy Saturday unfurled before us, I glanced over at Kevin, who was engrossed in his latest masterpiece, colors dancing across the canvas with the same vibrancy of our intertwined lives. I turned my gaze back to my own quiet space, the edges softened beneath the glow of a reading lamp, and felt a profound gratitude filling the air around us. We had showered each other with the understanding of our differences, and it made the world outside worthwhile. So, if you find yourself struggling to merge lives and routines, remember that it's in the honoring of those differences that the richest layers of love often reveal themselves. I've always loved being the fun aunt, the one who brought the best gifts and made the best jokes, but when my sister and her husband had kids, twins, no less, it felt like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, I was supposed to shower them with unconditional love, praise, and endless affection, but all I could feel was this nagging sense of disconnect. It's not that I didn't want to love them, I just couldn't seem to connect with them the way everyone expected. I remember visiting them a few days after they came home from the hospital. There were balloons and flowers everywhere, and my sister had that glow about her that only new parents get. The little ones lay sleeping in their cribs, swaddled tightly, and I felt this profound sense of anxiety wash over me. As I sat there, pretending to coo and fuss over them, all I could think was about how quiet it was, how distant it felt, like watching a movie through a foggy lens. I can't quite pinpoint when I started feeling this way. I think it was a few months in, during family gatherings, when I noticed the way everyone else looked at the twins, as if they were the center of the universe. I'd smile and play along, help change diapers and keep an eye on them when my sister needed a break, but every time they'd giggle at their parents' silly faces or reach for their hands, a part of me would turn cold. I started to dread all the family outings, feeling more like a spectator than a participant in my sister's new life. She'd look at me with those big expectant eyes, as if waiting for me to beam with pride or joy, but all I could manage was a thin smile while my chest tightened with guilt. Was this normal? I wondered if I was a bad person for not feeling that immediate rush of love everyone keeps talking about. One evening during dinner, the twins let out their loud, high-pitched cries, genuine, baby-like wails that tore through the happy chatter. Everyone jumped to their feet like they were hitting a pause button in a sitcom, and there I was, stuck at the table, fork halfway to my mouth, wondering why no one ever seemed to notice the way I felt. That night, I confided in my close friend, who suggested maybe I was just overwhelmed or needed time. "It's okay," she said, "not everyone falls in love immediately with babies." But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this wasn't a phase. What if I was just not cut out to be around them? As weeks turned into months, and I continued showing up for family dinners, my heart ached because I cared about my sister, her husband, and the kids in a way that felt different from what was expected of me. When my sister called me one night, so excited about their upcoming first birthday party and insisting that I prepare a special speech as the crazy aunt, I felt the weight of my silence grow heavier. I choked out some sort of muted excitement, but inside I was torn. Could I really stand in front of everyone, professing feelings that didn't live in my heart? Would they see me as the villain in this story? The climax of my internal struggle came that day at the birthday party. There were decorations everywhere, laughter filling the air, and a cacophony of joyful chaos swirling around me. As I smiled at the little darlings, I couldn't shake the feeling of just being an outsider in my own family. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood there, looking at those tiny faces with their cake-covered smiles. "I love you guys. I really do," I finally managed, the words feeling foreign yet necessary. And in that moment, I decided to lean into the love I could muster, imperfect and uncertain as it was. It didn't have to look like my sister's love, it just had to be mine. Walking away that evening, I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. I hadn't solved the problem, but maybe I didn't need to be the perfect aunt. I was learning that love can take many shapes, even ones that feel unsure. As for my sister? Well, she hasn't brought it up, but I think she knows. Maybe she could see the struggle reflected in my eyes, or maybe, deep down, she just wants me there, flaws and all. I guess time will tell if things will ever change between us. For now, I'm just trying to accept this complicated journey of love and connection, one awkward family dinner at a time. As I sat at the kitchen table, the sounds of laughter and playful squeals wafted in from the living room, where my sister's kids were ramping up for another round of their favorite game. I looked at the scattered remnants of dinner, spaghetti sauce splattered across plates, a half-eaten loaf of garlic bread, and felt that familiar churn in my stomach. It wasn't the food, I've always had a knack for cooking. No, it was the noise of joy reminding me of the gulf that seemed to yawn wider every time I sat in the midst of it. My sister, Marissa, was in her element, laughing as she tried to referee the chaos, a mixture of amusement and exasperation lighting up her eyes. I couldn't help but admire her, the way she navigated the madness with grace, her love bursting at the seams and spilling over into every corner of her home. And there I sat, a few steps back, fumbling to participate without truly understanding how to engage with the lives she was so passionately building. It made me feel like an imposter in my own family, awkward and not quite fitting the mold of the cool aunt I was supposed to be. Marissa had always been the one with the booming personality. She thrived in the company of others, drawing energy from their adoration while I often found comfort in the quiet corners, away from the spotlight. It wasn't that I didn't care about her children, I just felt a disconnect, a frayed wire in an otherwise buzzing circuit. I've often tried to connect with Lucy and Ben, aged 6 and 8, in little steps. I'd bring them treats when I visited, and I'd ask them questions about their favorite toys or the movies they liked. I wanted to understand their world, but the effort felt clumsy at times. A few weeks ago, I showed up with a brand new box of colorful markers and a stack of blank paper, hoping we could unleash some creativity together. "Look what I brought," I announced, watching eager smiles bloom like flowers. But somehow, my enthusiasm felt out of sync with theirs. They preferred the swift thrill of video games to the slower process of creating, sending me tumbling back into my insecurities. Did I even know how to be an aunt? As I caught a glimpse of my sister's easy banter with the kids, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that I was supposed to mirror her warmth. Maybe that was the essence of love in a family, this perfect, enveloping way of being that I struggled to emulate. It left me feeling inadequate, and in those moments, the tension would pull tight across my chest. Would they ever see me as someone who could be just as lovable, despite my hesitations? As I stared into my half-finished glass of Merlot, lost in my thoughts, I noticed Marissa glancing my way. She raised an eyebrow, and her expression shifted from amusement to something keenly perceptive, as if she could read the doubt swirling around in my mind. "Hey, wanna play with us?" Lucy's voice broke through the noise, her big eyes open wide with genuine hope. My heart fluttered, caught in the unexpected warmth of her invitation. Here was a chance to bridge the gap, to step into their world, even if it felt like a leap of faith. "I'm not very good at those games, sweetie," I replied with a hesitant smile, apologetic and self-aware. I saw a flicker of disappointment on her face, but then Ben chimed in, his enthusiasm infectious. "It doesn't matter. We'll teach you." The sheer sincerity in their voices made my heart twist in that bittersweet way. Maybe I could try. Maybe I didn't have to be perfect. In the end, I slowly made my way into the living room, resigning myself to the chaos that awaited me. The game was loud and frantic, full of the sort of competitive energy I usually avoided, one that filled me with anxiety instead of the thrill it sparked in others. I stumbled through the rules the kids shouted in tandem, mixing up characters and misinterpreting strategies, but amidst my blunders, laughter bubbled up and broke the tension like sunlight through clouds. There it was again, that feeling I often chased, the connection pulling us closer, however imperfect it was. As we played, I noticed Lucy and Ben sharing knowing glances, their laughter spilling over into my own smiles. I realized, then, that perhaps I didn't need to love them like their parents did. My love could be quieter, a whisperizing thread in their lives, invisible but strong. As the evening wound down, Marissa leaned in, her arm wrapping around my shoulder as the kids excitedly plotted their next gaming adventure. "You did good, sis. They love having you around," she said, her voice a mix of encouragement and sisterly confidence. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a flicker of understanding passing between us. It was a moment that made the earlier conversation about love and connections feel less daunting. Maybe love doesn't always scream, sometimes, it hums softly in shared spaces, even in silence. Sitting there surrounded by laughter and chaos, I dared to believe that love could grow in unexpected ways, holding imperfections at its center, and for the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened and content, like I belonged, flaws and all. As the evening wore on, I watched my sister interact with her kids, their laughter wrapping around us like a warm blanket. The way she knelt down to tie her youngest shoelaces, turning it into a game, her eldest giggling as they made silly faces at each other, I felt the edges of my heart begin to soften, the tension of my earlier doubts easing just a little. For so long, I had been an outsider in their world, fumbling through interactions with awkwardness, feeling like I was always one step behind in terms of affection. I sipped my drink, pretending to keep up with the adult conversations around me while stealing glances at my niece and nephew, watching them scramble for toys, their joy palpable. It was exhausting trying to figure out where I fit in, but with each chuckle that escaped their lips, I began to see pieces of myself reflected back at me, children thriving in their small universe of imagination. I leaned back in my chair and tried to enjoy the noise, the clattering of Legos on the floor and the hum of animated discussions about superheroes. "Hey, Auntie! Look at this!" My niece suddenly popped up beside me, clutching a crumpled piece of paper covered in colorful scribbles. She was beaming, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I made this just for you." I took the paper from her hands, the vibrant colors swirling chaotically across the page. It was an abstract masterpiece, a jumble of shapes that could be anything from rainbows to monsters. I felt a surge of affection, not because I was suddenly head over heels for her or fulfilling a norm of being the doting aunt, but because I saw her. I saw how hard she had worked to create something for me, to share a piece of her world, and that was something to cherish. Wow! I love it. I grinned wider than I had in weeks. Her face lit up like a Christmas tree, and in that instant, I knew this small exchange was a step forward, not a leap, but still something. I felt a stir of belonging that was heavy with imperfections. I looked over to my sister, and for a brief moment, our glances locked. Her smile was knowing, a shared acknowledgement of the work both of us were putting into our relationships. As the night progressed, I began to breathe a little easier, my laughter joining the cacophony of voices, allowing myself to be swept up in the nuances of family life. For several more hours, we huddled together around a mess of dinner plates, overflowed drinks, and overwhelmed conversations. When I left that night, I felt lighter than I had in ages. It was still going to be a long road. I wasn't naive enough to think that everything would magically change overnight. But I found solace in understanding that I didn't need to love my sister's children the way she did. Just my version of love, whatever that might look like, was perfectly valid. Perhaps love could be like this beautiful mess we'd created that night, a patchwork of doodles, varied textures, shades, and overlapping lines. Weeks turned into months, and as the holidays approached, I couldn't shake the sense of change that lingered in the air. I started offering to babysit occasionally, wanting to break through the barrier of unfamiliarity that had once made me feel like an outsider. I found myself emerging from my shell, directing silly puppet shows with mismatched socks, playing hide and seek in the corners of their home, and reading story after story until nap time was unavoidable. Each time I returned home, I would hang up my coat and find a small piece of my newfound warmth nestling in the pocket, a token of connection I didn't realize I was building. Looking back on that conversation with my sister, I realized how important it was for her too. She'd carved out space for me to be precisely who I was, without any expectations of perfection. It was in the little moments, the fleeting glances and shared laughter, that love unveiled itself in new forms. Perhaps we all could lean into our uncertainties, knowing that something beautiful could stem from the chaos, the imperfections, and the undying effort to bridge gaps, one family dinner, and one awkward exchange, at a time. I still think about that night occasionally, especially when I spy my niece decorating another crayon masterpiece, or my nephew zooming around with a superhero cape flapping in the wind. Love is like a starting point on a canvas, it unfolds endlessly, and I'm beginning to understand that being part of their world is just as special as creating my own path too. And in this ongoing journey, I'm learning to embrace the surprises and to keep the dialogue open, because maybe it's in the imperfections that we find the most authentic forms of connection. I never thought I'd be the one to put my foot down in our friend group, but here I am, standing on a precipice of sorts, caught between loyalty and discomfort. I'm Sarah, and I've been friends with Mike, Jess, and Clara for over a decade, since our awkward high school days. We've shared everything from triumphs to heartbreaks, always finding solace in each other's company, until house rules turned the company into a battlefield. It all started when we began hanging out at Mike's place more frequently. At first, it felt like an extension of our usual get-togethers, filled with laughter and shared snacks. But then, as the weeks turned to months, I started noticing little things, the strict silence during movie nights unless you had a comment worthy of praise, the way he would glance at his watch if someone went over their allowed time in the bathroom, and the unsolicited critique of how my coffee preference was too frivolous for an adult. It bugged me more than I wanted to admit, but I convinced myself it was just his quirk, something we could laugh about later. However, as the restrictions mounted, no arguing over board games, no using your phone unless it was for him, I began to see the cracks in our camaraderie. Jess and Clara were as uncomfortable as I was. I remember one night, sitting on the sagging couch, the air thick with tension as Mike launched into another diatribe about etiquette, and I felt my heart racing. After a particularly stifling evening, I brought it up to the group. "Do you think we should say something?" I asked, my voice carrying a hint of hesitance. Clara chewed her lip, glancing at Jess, who nodded slowly. We weren't mad at Mike for being himself, we just didn't want to live under a magnifying glass that forced us to tiptoe through every gathering. That's when I suggested we take a break from his house, for our own sanity, really. It's not about excluding him, it's about preserving what we've built together, I argued. They agreed, albeit hesitantly, and we decided to meet at Jess's place instead. The first time we did it, there was a relief that washed over us like an unexpected breeze. We chatted freely, erupted in laughter without checking the clock, and the pulse of our friendship returned. But, of course, Mike found out. I still remember the way his face twisted when he confronted me, hurt spilling out of his eyes like an open wound. "So, you don't want to hang out at my place anymore?" he asked incredulously, and I felt the guilt creep in. "It's not that, it's just..." I stumbled, realizing how fragile friendships can be. Our conversations became a series of circular debates after that, like two opposing trains on the same track. I didn't want to hurt him but felt compelled to stand my ground. Over the weeks that followed, the group dynamic shifted. While Jess and Clara enjoyed the newfound freedom, I found myself stuck in a loop of guilt and worry. What if we ended up pushing him away entirely? That thought haunted me, casting a shadow over our fun times. We tried inviting him to join us, but he'd show up with an attitude. It was just off. Little jabs, remarks about our advanced carefree spirit, and things that made it clear he was petulant over our decision. I wanted to talk him into understanding that it wasn't about him, it was about the environment. Yet, every time I opened my mouth, words felt inadequate. The tension simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Some nights, lying in bed, I thought about how friendships evolve. I wondered if I had crossed a line, whether I truly was the asshole. In my heart, I wanted to say no. I believed compromise is part of any relationship, but I never had the guts to confront Mike again, fearing it would unravel the fragile thread holding us together. Looking back now, I realize it took months of distance for us to finally communicate properly. We met up again for coffee, at a neutral spot because the house rule debates just got way too heavy, but this time, the walls were down. We could finally talk about how our friendship had changed without the pressure of the rigid rules. There was still hurt, okay, a lot of hurt, but also a willingness to listen. We discussed boundaries, about what felt comfortable, and, strangely enough, Mike confessed how much he feared being left out. Somehow, through all the misunderstandings, we found common ground. It's a messy process, friendships, but I think we're on the way back to being whole again, or at least learning how to navigate this new chapter together. One thing's for sure, though, I'd never advocate for ghosting a friend over house rules again. As I sit here reflecting on all that's happened, the weight of that weekend is still with me, heavy yet oddly uplifting. I thought letting go of the rigid house rules would lead us to a happier place, but seeing how it unraveled initially had me questioning my instincts. The truth is, Mike's home had always been our sanctuary, a gathering spot where laughter echoed late into the night. But it was also a space where unspoken tension lingered, hovering above us like a dark cloud just waiting to rain. When I encouraged the group to rethink our visits, stating that the rules about food and drinks, even how we talked around certain topics, were stifling, I felt more like a provocateur than a friend trying to protect our dynamic. When we finally confronted Mike together, it felt like peeling back layers we'd been adding to ourselves over the years. Words flowed as we sat in the living room, the familiar walls lined with photos of memories that now felt tainted by our recent rifts. I watched as Mike's face shifted from hurt to confusion and then slowly to realization. I could see that we weren't just addressing rules, we were unpacking insecurities and meticulously wrapping each other in empathy. The feeling of isolation I'd sensed in him, an atmosphere thick enough to choke on, dissolved into light when he shared that he feared being left out, that he'd built those rules as a safeguard but had instead trapped himself in us. When we spoke about boundaries, I felt a sense of catharsis. It was remarkably humbling to see Mike's vulnerability wash over him like a tide, and I reflected on how often I'd felt the same dread of being uninvited or merely ignored. There was a rawness to those conversations that left us breathless, yet relieved in an odd way, like a storm finally clearing. One by one, we shared our own burdens, the little things that built up over time, creating resentment. A sense of understanding formed between us, like an invisible bond tightening with each confession. By the end of our heart-to-heart, we dismantled the fear-based structure of our friendship to make room for something more authentic. Though there was still a long way to go, hurts can be stubborn like weeds in a garden, we promised to work through them together, to navigate this way forward like a group of explorers hunting for new paths in familiar woods. I might not have all the answers, but one thing became abundantly clear: I didn't want to lose our connection over something so fundamental as house rules, which, when you peel back the layers, stemmed from fears both spoken and unspoken. As I look back now, I feel relieved that we could transform dysfunction into an opportunity for deeper bonds. It reminded me that friendships are messy, yes, but they're ours to cultivate. I learned that conversation is the best fertilizer we could provide, nurturing dialogue until we were finally comfortable sitting together in silence again, knowing we'd chosen each other, rules or no rules. Life has a way of teaching lessons when you least expect it. Beyond the surface issues, we unearth deeper truths about ourselves and one another that I think will keep us anchored through whatever storms lie ahead. As I look back now, I feel relieved that we could transform dysfunction into an opportunity for deeper bonds. It reminded me that friendships are messy, yes, but they're ours to cultivate. I learned that conversation is the best fertilizer we could provide, nurturing dialogue until we were finally comfortable sitting together in silence again, knowing we'd chosen each other, rules or no rules. Life has a way of teaching lessons when you least expect it. Beyond the surface issues, we unearth deeper truths about ourselves and one another that I think will keep us anchored through whatever storms lie ahead. One evening, as we gathered at the park, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting golden rays over our small assembly of blankets and snacks, I could hear their laughter, a sound that had felt distant for so long. There was a lightness in the air, a tangible ease, and for a moment, I let myself be fully present, breathing it all in. As we passed around a shared bowl of popcorn, Mike looked around and broke the comfortable silence. "You know," he said, tossing a kernel into his mouth, "I had this idea that all of you were ganging up on me when you started coming over less often. I thought I was the nuisance." His laughter was half-hearted, but it kicked off a cascading effect, each of us nodding along as we revealed our own misunderstandings, our own doubts that had turned into insecurities. It turned into a revelation, a realization that we were all human, each guarding things that shouldn't be bottled up. I remember feeling a swell of gratitude wash over me, realizing that this group could survive the rough patches, that we could be honest without fear of judgment. It felt oddly cathartic, acknowledging those feelings rather than letting them fester. Then Christine, who had been mostly quiet, chimed in with a shaky but determined voice, "We've all felt anxious about something, haven't we? Whether it's about being too clingy, or feeling like we don't belong." The honesty hung in the air, a unifying thread that wove us closer. I saw lighter sparks in their eyes, each of us willing to step outside our comfort zones for the sake of our friendship. I felt lighter too. Maybe this was how growth looked, sometimes jagged, sometimes beautiful. The next week, we organized a board game night, a perfect excuse to hang out without the shadows of rules hanging overhead. We laughed, we argued over game pieces, and at one point, Mike playfully accused me of cheating, but instead of letting it spiral into an argument, I laughed it off. "Okay, guilty as charged." Then we both burst into laughter, and it felt like every uncomfortable moment from the previous weeks had burned away, just smoke dissipating into the night sky. I packed my things to leave that evening, and as we said our goodbyes, I felt a genuine warmth. We shared a group hug, an unspoken agreement that we'd keep fighting for this thing we had, however imperfect. I hoped we'd learn to communicate enough that no one felt left out or diminished again. As I walked back home, under a blanket of stars, I smiled at the thought of what we'd built, a bridge over a tumultuous river instead of letting it swallow us whole. Life might throw more storms our way, but now at least, we had boats together. I resolved to never forget that conversation is magic, and in a world where people often ghost each other over differences, we chose connection instead. As I settled into bed that night, I felt something bittersweet creeping in, an acknowledgement that while we had made progress, we were still a work in progress ourselves. But maybe that was okay, too. We'd navigate this new chapter together, collected not as perfect friends but as imperfect allies in this life, and I was more grateful than ever to be on this journey with them. It all began one breezy afternoon, the golden light softly washing over my living room as I contemplated the simple yet profound rules that shaped my family dynamics, rules I had never quite realized would lead me down a rabbit hole of conflict and introspection. I had always treasured the close bond we had with my mother, a relationship built on love, memories, and the occasional clash of strong wills. But one evening, as my 8-year-old daughter, Alice, casually referred to my mother as honey during dinner, I felt a jolt, a dislocation of sorts within my heart. To most, this would seem harmless, a term of endearment seamlessly woven into the fabric of family life. To me, however, it opened a floodgate of unresolved emotions. I grew up witnessing my mother's complicated lifestyle, riddled with bouts of neglect and fierce independence that often made her more of a friend than a caregiver. I never questioned the absence of authority in her role, and yet, hearing Alice call her honey felt like an invitation to intimacy that my mother had not earned, a privilege I feared she would abuse. As the days rolled on, I wrestled silently with my feelings, peering into the depths of my mother's approval-seeking behavior, a pattern that had burned me time and again. I decided it was time to set boundaries that would shield my children from the unpredictability of her affection, and so I told Alice, "Sweetheart, it's not okay to call Grandma honey. Her name is Grandma." For Alice's naturally curious and sensitive nature, this prompt seemed a perplexing riddle. Her eyes brimmed with confusion, and I instantly felt a twinge of guilt. Yet I knew this was one of the only ways I could protect my children from the emotional instability that lurked beneath my mother's charming exterior. I imagined possible scenarios, Alice running to her honey for comfort, only to have those sweet moments twisted into half-hearted fits of affection that would leave her confused and wounded. That alone rearranged the pieces of my heart as I guided my daughter to navigate relationships with care. Yet, my gentle restrictions, which I viewed as necessary, did not sit well with my mother. She confronted me during one of our weekly calls, her usually warm voice growing strident as I could tell her feelings were hurt. "Why can't my grandchildren call me what they want?" she asked, her emotional undertones thickening the air between us. I felt compelled to defend my position, explaining that I wanted to maintain clear boundaries for their well-being, citing a few painful memories from my childhood that felt necessary to share. Instead of understanding, however, my revelations only fueled her resentment, breeding a kind of animosity that I had hoped to avoid. "You think you're protecting them," she snapped, "but all you're doing is pushing me away." Caught in that tsunami of emotions, the guilt over distancing my children from their grandmother and the insistence on maintaining their mental health, I found myself questioning whether I truly was the villain in this tale. Days passed, with tension hanging palpably in the air, until, one evening, my husband offered insight that struck a nerve. "You're just creating a cycle," he said softly, prompting a cascade of realizations. In my zeal to protect my children, I had inadvertently mirrored my mother's behaviors, shutting her out just as she once shut me out. As the weeks rolled into months, I let go of my rigid stance and, with a mixture of trepidation and hope, confronted my mother once more. We met in a local cafe, a place where we could relay the unspoken words over warm cups of coffee. I took a breath, recognizing the fragility of our interaction, and nervously explained, "I want to share this love with my children but fear for their emotional health." To my surprise, she opened up, acknowledging her past mistakes, and in that moment of vulnerability, I could see her as a flawed human being rather than the formidable figure I had cast her as for so long. We talked for 3 hours, our words weaving a new understanding among the crisscross threads of hurt and love. By the time we left that cafe, we made a gentle pact. My children could call her whatever felt right, but curiosity would remain the guide. If my mother's affection strayed into chaos, I would be there to help them navigate through the tumult, lifting them back onto their feet when the light dimmed. It was a delicate balance, but so long as we kept communication coherent, there was a glimmer of hope for a new chapter. Months later, my kids call her Grandma, honey, and sometimes even Grandma honey on whimsical days. It brings a smile to my face, a small triumph of compromise over conflict. Reflection has carved deeper insights into my soul, and if I've learned anything from this saga of boundaries, it's that relationships thrive where understanding flourishes, even from the pains of our past. As I gaze at my mother with a heart filled with tenderness rather than resentment, I remind myself that although nobody is perfect, the love we share can still bridge the gaping chasms left behind by misunderstandings. I've become the guardian of my children's choices, but in opening the door just a crack, I've also invited my mother into a more stable chapter of our lives, one where love doesn't have to be earned or lost, only shared. Our evenings began to take on a new rhythm, one where laughter resonated through our home in a different way. The clinking of dinner plates mingled with soft conversations, and during those times, I watched my mother transform before my eyes. The rigid demeanor she wore like a shield slowly melted away, revealing glimpses of the woman I remembered from my childhood, the one who would spin fantastical tales of her youth and make blueberry pancakes on Saturday mornings. Each time my children called her honey, it felt like they were shaping their own relationship with her, possibly one built on affection rather than the fraught history I had held onto for so long. I began to understand that the term didn't erase the years of disappointment, rather, it was a step toward redefining connection, an invitation for both my mother and my kids to forge a bond that could empower them all. It wasn't easy. I still felt pangs of concern whenever my mother slipped into old habits, her sharp tongue ready to cut down any misstep with a quip that could sting. One evening, as my daughter, Lily, baked cookies with my mother, I caught a glimpse of their interaction from the kitchen doorway. My mother had an apron tied around her waist, flour dusting her cheek as she helped Lily roll out the dough. They giggled so genuinely that it made my heart swell, but almost immediately, A familiar icy apprehension chilled my joy. Had I truly invited someone who had disappointed me in the past into my children's sacred spaces? But as I sat watching, I realized that this was my mother trying to change, to fit into a narrative that no longer centered on her past failures but on the potential for love and acceptance. That realization sparked something in me, an acceptance that some relationships are worth bending rules for. Gradually, I found myself loosening the tight grip I had on my judgment, allowing myself to witness moments that reminded me of the shared humanity between us. One rainy Saturday, my mother and I sat on the porch while the kids splashed in puddles, the sound of their laughter muffled by the patter of raindrops on the roof. We exchanged small talk, and when I brought up her choices in the past, she surprised me with an unexpected openness. "I know I messed up," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I didn't have the tools or the knowledge then. I want to learn, not just for myself, but for them. For you." I was taken aback. The recognition of her shortcomings was something I had longed to hear, yet it felt surreal to finally take a step together in something resembling vulnerability. There was no dramatic confession, just a genuine attempt to connect over our shared history. I felt a lightness in my chest, a whisper of hope that perhaps we could build something stronger together. A week later, while we picnicked in the park, Lily climbed into my mother's lap, looking up at her with awe. "Honey," she called sweetly, "can you tell us about the time you met the runaway dog?" My mother's eyes sparkled at the thought, and as she started to weave a story filled with charm and whimsy, I noticed the children were completely engaged, hanging on to each word and all the playful embellishments. For the first time in so long, I didn't feel the urge to guard the children from their grandmother. I realized I was letting go of the fear that had gripped my heart for years. I smiled, absorbing the moment, where laughter echoed through trees swaying gently in the summer breeze, and I began to see the foundation of a relationship being built. Right before my eyes. It was with a sense of cautious optimism that I concluded this journey. The path to evolving our relationship was not without bumps. We often still navigated through the minefield of miscommunication and unspoken grievances. Nevertheless, I held on to the belief that building trust took time and that love could flourish amongst the fragile roots of our shared past. Days turned into weeks, and the more I witnessed my children's genuine affection for my mother, the deeper my resolve grew to encourage it. Sure, we faced setbacks along the way. Old habits die hard, and sometimes my mother would slip back into sarcasm or dismissive remarks. But I could intervene, guiding her tone or redirecting the emphasis in our conversations without that ever-present burden of guilt. As the seasons shifted, so did our family dynamic. Thanksgiving rolled around, and as we gathered around the table, Lily took it upon herself to have everyone share what they were thankful for. When it was my mother's turn, she looked at the room full of grateful eyes, and with a quivering voice, she said, "I'm thankful for second chances, for a family that could forgive and, more importantly, for the love that connects us even when we have the past whispering in our ears." In that moment, my heart swelled, a quiet comfort settling in, as I recognized that perhaps the new chapter we were all seeking wasn't just about rebuilding what was lost but also about discovering new facets of each other. Watching my children engaging with their grandmother, embracing her as honey, taught me that healing takes time and that love is a tapestry woven from acceptance and understanding. I realized I'd become less the guardian of their choices and more a nurturer of their relationships, guiding them through the fragile landscapes of familial dynamics with newfound wisdom. And as I reflected on the journey we shared, smiling at the laughter resonating between the walls of our home, I felt a sense of peace. Healing and connections are not linear paths, they are messy, intricate, and absolutely worth every twist and turn. In the months following, we continued to foster this merging of families, keeping communication open and embracing one another's imperfections. Life hadn't magically transformed overnight, but we had discovered ways to create a rhythm that celebrated our unique individualities. I dared to believe that, while relationships are complex, they are also transformative. Each time I caught my children calling my mother honey, I would smile softly, knowing that they are building bridges that I had once thought irreparable. In doing so, we were not just healing old wounds but laying the groundwork for a beautifully intricate tapestry of love that could stretch across generations. As we moved further into this new chapter, I watched my children blossom in the forgiving warmth of their grandmother's embrace. It was a subtly beautiful transformation. At times, I would overhear them whispering secrets to her, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves outside our window, painting a picture that felt rich and vibrant. It was a far cry from the tense atmosphere we used to have, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Instead, there was a lightness in the air, a tangible ease that swept through our home like a gentle breeze. My mother began to impress upon them the same stories that once wove the fabric of my own childhood, tales of adventure and mischief shared with my siblings that transformed even the simplest moments into cherished memories. I could see it in her eyes. Each mention of honey from my kids was a reminder that she could still be a good grandmother, that love could be expressed in many ways, and that forgiveness was not the absence of past hurts but the acceptance of them. It wasn't without its awkward moments, of course. There were times when I couldn't help but wince, memories of her difficult past rushing back like an unwelcome tide. But then I would remind myself that everyone is just a story waiting to be rewritten, and change, however small, deserves to be celebrated, even if it takes time to feel whole. One particularly serene afternoon, we gather in the living room, the sun pouring warmth through the windows, casting a golden hue on the walls. My children are sprawled on the floor, building a tower of blocks that seems to teeter precariously, while my mother sits nearby sipping her tea, her laughter ringing like the clinking of wind chimes. I glance at her, noticing how gently she guides their hands, offering suggestions instead of commands. "If we put this one here," she says with a smile, "it's going to topple less." I remember how, in my youth, her words often felt heavy, but now they dance lightly around the room, filled with affection. In that moment, I see the lessons unfolding, the ways in which they are teaching her patience just as much as she is teaching them about creativity and balance. It dawned on me that this new dynamic wasn't solely an opportunity for my children to connect with their grandmother but was healing me too, reshaping the broken pieces of our relationship into something sturdy and dependable. I allowed myself to breathe deeply, relishing the moment, when suddenly my daughter, engrossed in her building project, turned to my mother and casually said, "Hey, honey, can you help?" The word slipped out with the familiarity of an everyday phrase, and I could see the way my mother's eyes sparkled with joy, startled and delighted all at once. There was no hesitation in her smile, it was genuine and pure. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, scooting closer to help. A warmth unfurled inside me, and for the first time, I didn't flinch on hearing that name float from their lips. Instead, I recognized it as a marker of progress, a gentle reminder that my mother was patching the wounds of her past, stitching herself into our lives, and that I was finally letting go of some of mine. As days turned into weeks, I found that the small things began to shift. Our collective laughter echoed more freely, the unturned corner of my maternal heart felt lighter, and those earlier fears that had once held me captive began to dissolve like mist under the sun. I watched my mother slip more easily into her role, her hesitations fading with each visit. The kids grew more confident in their affection, using names of endearment that bounced off the walls and wrapped around us like a favorite blanket. Each honey became a reverberation of love and an acceptance that we were all imperfect in our ways, doing our best to stitch together the tapestry we called family. There was no grand epiphany, no fixed moment that illustrated our triumph, but rather the quiet realization that connection can flicker ignited even in seemingly insurmountable darkness through small acts of love and openness. As well as the growing comfort of understanding our shared journey, it was in these moments, simple yet profound, that I learned we had become a constellation, each star a unique point of light, interconnected by a shared history and new aspirations. And as I tucked my children into bed that night, their giggles still swirling in the air, I knew that we had turned a page in our story, one full of potential, ready to explore what it means to be a family in the truest sense. I whispered, "Good night, my loves," and as they snuggled deeper into their blankets, I couldn't help but smile, feeling the threads of our tapestry weave tighter around my heart. I closed the door softly behind me, letting the echoes of their laughter linger in the hallway, and for the first time in a long time, I felt an all-encompassing peace settle over me, a delightful realization that in the end, love always finds a way to triumph over pain. I never expected to find myself at odds with my family over something as simple as a door. Living alone in a small apartment, I had carved out my little sanctuary, a place where I could escape the world's chaos and indulge in quiet moments with a good book or a long, hot shower. It was my haven, and after the relentless demands of work and social events that filled my calendar, I often craved solitude. That's why, when my aunt and uncle decided to drop by unannounced last Saturday, I felt a rush of anxiety flood through me like ice water. I had barely returned from a stressful week at the office, 2 deadlines looming over me like dark clouds, and the last thing I needed was an unexpected visit. When I heard the persistent knock on my door, my heart sank. Every part of my being screamed to ignore it, to hunker down with some takeout and let the world fade away. They were the kind of relatives who wouldn't take no for an answer, and I had a pretty good idea that they wouldn't be content with a quick pleasantry at the door before moving on. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. What if they couldn't see how tired I was? Just duck into the kitchen and hope they give up, I thought, but the knocking intensified, almost urgent. I took a deep breath and, against my better judgment, I opened the door just a crack, enough to catch a glimpse of their expectant faces. The look of surprise on my uncle's face morphed into disappointment as he realized I wasn't prepared for their visit. "Oh, hey. We thought we'd stop by. It's been ages," he exclaimed, as if time bent and twisted in some miraculous way to make their interruption appropriate. I felt the corners of my mouth twitch with nerves. "Hi, yeah, sorry. I didn't know you were coming," I stammered, avoiding their eager gazes. The truth was, I was overwhelmed, tired, and bleeding introversion that day. The warmth of my community sometimes felt like a suffocating blanket rather than a comforting embrace. I wanted to say, "I love you both, but could you please just text first next time?" Instead, I just stood there while they continued to chatter about their week like I should be all ears. In amidst their dialogue, my thoughts spiraled. Am I being unreasonable? Am I really the boss of my own space, or have I lost touch with what family means? I scanned the apartment and realized my living room looked like a tornado had swept through. Mismatched socks strewn on the floor, a half-eaten slice of pizza languishing on the coffee table, definitely not the kind of setting I wanted to showcase. I knew they would judge, not that they meant to, but from experience, I knew my aunt's disapproving eyebrow would only rise higher the longer I stood there. "You have a minute?" she asked, as they pushed their way inside, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside me. "Actually, I'm really in the middle of something," I mumbled, my voice barely more than a whisper. But my attempt to stand my ground fell flat. Family members don't generally take those kinds of refusals on face value. And, like a slow-burning fuse, resentment began to ignite. I felt trapped between my genuine care for them and my desperate need for peace. The unease spun into a knot in my stomach. Was I the bad guy for wanting to protect my own mental space? They began to settle in, invading my sanctuary with their animated banter, laying their jackets on my couch, leaning over to inspect my bookshelves as if they were an exhibit. It dawned on me that they had no clue how much I longed for solitude at that moment, how important those quiet Saturday afternoons were for my sanity. The more they laughed and caught up, the more distant I felt, like a spectator in my own life. I remembered countless Sunday dinners when spontaneity put a smile on my face, but this one was different. A part of me wanted to just fold into their warmth, to let the walls come down, but the other part was desperate for a clean break from the world outside. Finally, after an hour of small talk filled with casual questions about my work and my love life, or lack thereof, I mustered the courage to intervene, gently asserting, "Hey, I really appreciate you guys stopping by, but I'm feeling a bit exhausted. Can we catch up another time?" Their cheerful expressions faltered, disappointment clouding their faces. "Oh, but we came all this way," my aunt began, her voice dropping an octave, inscribing guilt deeper into the fabric of my resolve. "That's the thing about family, sometimes, even love can carry an expectation, an unspoken demand that feels heavier than steel." As they finally gathered their things, I felt a mix of relief and guilt gnawing at my insides. Had I overstepped? Was I too harsh in my execution? I closed the door behind them, their voices fading down the hall, questioning my choices like fair-minded jurors. Hours passed, and I sat cross-legged on the floor amidst the chaos of my living space, letting the internal battle wane. The authenticity of my emotions washed over me in waves. Maybe I wasn't the asshole. Maybe needing alone time wasn't some personal failing. But the lingering question echoed in my mind, would they see it that way? In the days that followed, I texted my aunt to suggest we meet for coffee later in the week. "I'm sorry I wasn't up for a visit, work has been a lot," I wrote, hoping to bridge the chasm. I saw her reply flash on the screen, "No worries, we'll plan something. We miss you." Part of me sighed in relief, while another part knew this was just the beginning of a longer conversation about boundaries, connection, and the balance of family. Because in the end, maybe it wasn't about being right or wrong, perhaps it was about understanding each other's needs without sacrificing one's own peace. And maybe, just maybe, I could learn to do both. That interaction with my mom lingered in my mind for days. I took that moment to reflect on our relationship, something I had been avoiding for far too long. I never intended to be the estranged family member. I simply found myself caught in the whirlwind of adult life, work obligations, personal goals, and the day-to-day chaos that came with it. But their way of expressing love felt overwhelming at times, like a tidal wave crashing over me. I set aside my phone and gazed out the window, watching as leaves scattered in the wind, twisting and turning in ways that reminded me of the often erratic nature of our family dynamics. My family had long adopted a policy of drop by unannounced, a tradition I found charming at first but now felt like an intrusion into my carefully curated solitude. I appreciated the effort, truly, but I questioned whether they understood that my home was my sanctuary, a place I needed to recharge away from the world's demands. The guilt of not being who they wanted me to be crept in like an unwanted guest, taunting me with thoughts of how they must perceive my distance. Yet, I had never felt more like myself than I did now, navigating my boundaries. It didn't take long for that uneasy tension to rise again when Thomas, my brother, suggested a weekend visit. I braced myself, knowing that I'd be the odd one out at the dinner table, dishing out platitudes while my family laughed over nostalgic stories, all while I hovered over my thoughts like a wallflower at a party. This time, though, I felt a tug, a mix of obligation and desire to maintain that connection, even if it was strained. "Hey, can we chat about when you guys come?" I typed hesitantly, deciding to voice my concerns before the weekend arrived. I didn't want another instance of family craziness that left me feeling frazzled and misunderstood. A short reply came back, "What's up? We're excited to see you." I swallowed hard. There was that sense of enthusiasm again, crackling through the screen as if I were there with them. Maybe it was an opportunity for understanding, or perhaps it would swing like a pendulum back to my fears of rejection. Saturday morning drapes the house in a hazy light, and the doorbell pierces through the quiet like a gunshot. My heart races as I stand in the middle of the living room, frozen in place, and the moment stretches into eternity. Hand clenched around the doorknob, I hesitated, considering the possibility of peeling back the layers of silence, of explaining that I craved acceptance of my choices, my pace, my space. Instead, I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, plastering on a smile that I hoped didn't betray any anxiety. Their startled faces morphed into grins, and the warmth of their presence filled the hallway, intoxicating and overwhelming all at once. "We brought your favorite." My mom held up a blueberry pie, and for a fleeting second, the sweetness of nostalgia wrapped around me like a hug, but the tension brewed just beneath. I invited them in, trying desperately to hold on to the comfort while wrestling with unease. As they settled in like they owned the place, the conversations rushed and tumbled over each other, but every sound felt amplified, a cacophony of expectation, love, and my desire for silence. I knew I had to seize this moment to lay bare my feelings. "You know," I started, my voice shaking slightly, "I appreciate these spontaneous visits, I really do, but sometimes I just need a little heads up." They halted, all eyes on me, surprise etched across their faces. My stomach knotted, and I can hardly bear the silence that ensued. But then, slowly, my brother nodded while my mom frowned slightly, a wrinkle of puzzlement forming on her forehead. "Oh, honey, we didn't know you felt that way," she whispered, her voice softening. A flicker of hope ignited in me. The moment hung in the air, heavy yet tender, and in that silence, acceptance danced delicately among us, paving a newfound path. As the afternoon rolled on, we spoke more openly, the conversation bridged gaps I feared would swallow me whole. They acknowledged my need for space, and slowly, we carved out a rhythm that allowed for both connection and solitude. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the blue sky igniting in a riot of orange and pink hues, we had not only shared laughter and stories but also something even more precious, understanding. I sat back, quietly content, relishing the newfound balance of knowing that love could be given without drowning, that boundaries didn't have to mean isolation, and yes, that my voice mattered in the symphony of our family. As I waved goodbye, my heart felt a little lighter, and I realized this was just the beginning, not just for them, but for me, a dance toward that ever-elusive harmony between connection and self-care. As I watched their car disappear down the winding road, clarity washed over me. I had navigated so many emotional landmines recently, battling guilt and resentment while trying to figure out where I fit into this intricate web of familial love and obligations. I couldn't help but smile. Maybe it wasn't about asserting myself with brash words or avoidance anymore, it was about conversing, sharing space, and, most importantly, communicating my needs without feeling like I was the villain. I felt like I was finally shedding the layers of guilt that had wrapped around me like a heavy blanket for years. The next week, I decided to open a dialogue with my siblings during our regular Sunday video call. The cozy backdrop of my living room, with its soft, ambient lighting, felt like a good setting for what I hoped would be an honest discussion. As we chatted, I could feel my heart racing a little. My brother started talking about an upcoming family reunion, throwing numbers and dates at me as if I was sitting on the edge of a precipice. The old urge to either withdraw or placate them bubbled up. Hold on a minute, I finally found my voice and said. I really appreciate that you guys want to include me, but I've been feeling overwhelmed with everything. The screen filled with thoughtful faces as I tried to find the right words. I love you all, and I want to be part of this, but I also need time for myself. If I push myself to show up for everything, I won't be able to show up at all, I confessed. Silence followed, a rare occurrence. I could see my sister's brow furrowing, and I worried I'd said too much. Then, slowly, her expression softened. I get that, she said. We want you to take care of yourself. You're not being selfish. You're human. That simple acknowledgement felt like a life buoy tossed my way when I had been treading water trying to keep everyone else afloat. One by one, they shared. They talked about their own struggles balancing social events and the pressure to conform to family expectations. As I listened, something shifted in the energy of our call, an empathic exchange that filled the gaps I had felt before. Each realization we shared breathed new life into our connection. By the end of that hour, I felt more heard and understood than I had in years. The weight of expectation lifted a little more off my chest, replaced by a reassuring warmth. Maybe they did see me and my struggles after all. Weeks turned into months, and I began to reshape not just my boundaries but our collective family dynamics. I found peace in saying what I needed, be it declining an invitation or suggesting a smaller gathering over a chaotic family event. Surprisingly, changes rippled through us. My siblings began to vocalize their own needs more openly, and in a way, we all started forging a richer, more authentic relationship. In realizing my own boundaries, I inadvertently encouraged them to explore theirs. Looking back, it's funny how that initial hesitation to open the door to unannounced visitors had been a pivotal moment. I didn't shut them out, I just showed them I needed space, a new boundary. It wasn't a rejection, it was a request for understanding. Life with family wasn't about keeping score or avoiding conflict, it was about building a comfortable home in each other's hearts, however imperfect the walls might be. And here I am, on the edge of another sunset, wondering what the future holds for us all, MacGuffins of emotion and history mingling with reverberations of laughter and love. I can feel the promise of more conversations ahead that will continue to carve out our path as we venture toward a fuller, more nuanced version of family. It's not a perfect resolution, but it's a hopeful beginning, one day at a time.